My name's Roy Pogorzelski. I'm Métis from northern Saskatchewan. My family's come from the communities of Green Lake and Meadow Lake. I've been raised very culturally and traditionally into my culture. I'm a Métis dancer, a Red River jigger, and very involved in my culture as a Métis person. I'm also a German. My other side of the family is German immigrants to Canada, so I also have German in my identity as well. In my formal field of study, I'm in Indigenous studies. I actually instruct Indigenous studies at the University of Lethbridge in Aboriginal law and Aboriginal politics. And I've taught Métis culture and history at the university level. Um, as well, I studied formally in Indigenous studies and human justice at the University of Regina. And I did my master's at the Catholic University of Leuven in Belgium in cultures and development studies. And now I'm currently doing my PhD in culture, social, and political thought at the University of Lethbridge and a Doctor of Philosophy. Some of the agencies that I've worked for and currently work for, I'm a manager of learning at the Canadian Centre for Diversity and Inclusion, and former to that was an associate to CCDI in regards to reconciliation and their community of practice events around that. I'm also on the Canadian Race Relations Foundation Board of Directors, and I was formerly on the Anti-Racism Advisory Council for the province of Alberta, uh, I was one of the first cohort appointed to that council. When I was born in 1982, I often make a joke that two very important things happened in the country in 1982. The first one was that Aboriginal rights and treaty rights were recognized and affirmed in the Constitution. And the other one was I was born. But being born in 1982, to my mother who, lived in northern Saskatchewan, my grandma who were in the schools in northern Saskatchewan, and being raised, my mom's an Indigenous woman of color. So being raised, you always saw how she was treated in society. You started to learn about the oppression of our family members, especially post 1885, as a number of my grandfathers were up in northern Saskatchewan and they fought to defend Métis culture and land rights up in northern Saskatchewan with names that most Canadians know, like Louis Riel and Gabriel Dumont. And just to see the oppression that many of my family members had faced and encountered in Saskatchewan and throughout the homeland, you just start to you're raised in kind of this world where you're seeing overt discrimination towards Indigenous people. And myself, I'm light skinned Métis, and with that comes certain levels of privilege, as well as I have my father's paternal last name of Pogorzelski. So it was always interesting seeing how my mom navigated in community with being an Indigenous woman of color, and how myself I was afforded certain privileges. One of the biggest challenges is became when I would hear the truth from people. They would come up and they would talk to me and they would say just very ignorant or very hurtful things about Indigenous people. And that always had a very hurtful effect on me growing up as a young person, because you were very connected to a very strong Indigenous upbringing and a very strong Indigenous culture. So those navigating those worlds were kind of made me realize very quickly that I was drawn to social justice work, distributive justice, restorative justice processes, and that I wanted to make an impact on community, educating about who the Métis people were, because there wasn't a lot of information or education about who the Métis people are. And there was a lot of misconceptions and stereotypes and prejudgments about Métis people. So when I was in university, I really started to realize that I wanted to be involved, that was in a way that I could contribute to the education around Indigenous issues in Canada. And then it kept spurring even more into where I started getting involved in anti-racism work and connecting with people from different backgrounds, cultures, ways of life, abilities, different sources of income. And when I went, my first job was in a nonprofit sector, doing human rights work and mediating human rights disputes. And at that point, I got to hear a lot of lived experiences from racialized individuals, from Indigenous individuals, and I got to mediate and some concerns and validate some concerns around this. And this was back in about over 10 years ago. And there wasn't really a lot going around in the way of education when it came to human rights work or anti-racism work. So I felt really compelled to educate about who Indigenous peoples were in this country and really myth bust a lot of the prejudices that Indigenous peoples encountered. And from there, it just became working in anti-racism work in general, and that became a passion of mine, and continued work. And as you meet more people in this field and more people doing this work, it just becomes it becomes it's a tiring field to be in. It's an amazing field to be in, because you're surrounded by some of the most incredible and passionate, wonderful human beings that really are fighting for concrete change in systems and institutions, and just in our society and our community in general. And they're such change makers and educators around human rights work that it's so inspiring. But I do recognize how tiring anti-racism work is, and I do recognize the emotional labor, the emotional tax that goes into it from people like myself who are Métis or Indigenous, or people, racialized individuals or people of color. You know, when we come into this field, it can be very challenging when you're having conversations about race, and you become almost a spokesperson in some way on certain subjects, or what they call you a subject matter expert, when really it's about lived experience in this realm. And so for me, my identity has always led me because of especially looking back on my mom and my family's upbringing and their background as strong Métis people has had a very profound impact on the way that I navigate myself through Canadian society and interact and engage with other people as well. You know, if you look back on history and we start having conversations about history, one of my ultimate favorite stories I love to tell in the classroom is of one of my heroes, Howard Adams. He was the first Métis PhD candidate, or actual full-time Métis PhD, and he went down to the United States to UC Berkeley to watch a presentation. And at that presentation, there was a young speaker named Malcolm X. And as he watched that speaker, he was inspired. And when he came back to Canada, he started working to bring out Métis rights during that civil rights period. It's interesting when we look back at history, we've seen so many leaders, you know, even in all of our different realms, we've seen activists and leaders that are in our histories that have worked hard, fought hard. Some are well known, some not as well known in the public light, but they're people that have continued to fight against oppression, against racism. And so coming to this point here in 2020, with the tragic death of George Floyd, you know, which really brought out to light. And I mean, when you look at today's standards, the way technology has interacted and engaged with the way that we see the world now. And during the Black Lives Matter protests that followed that, there was a lot of TikTok videos in and amongst the protests that you could watch. And I remember myself being glued to TikTok, watching these videos on the ground, and the way that technology puts out information and engages with information was something that's quite a bit different today. It's not saying that we don't understand the importance of history, or that we can't go back and analyze movements and situations and social movements. But I think today, mixed with a pandemic and a larger movement to break down systemic and institutionalized barriers, you know, this became uh, something that put the world on notice. Most people were in lockdown in March, and they were sitting in their houses, and they were exposed to different forms of media that brought this to a global consciousness that we haven't seen before. And it really raised the spotlight on just how corrupt and damaging and oppressive that our systems are, not only in United States, but also here in Canada. When it looks at things like policing, and it looks at the justice system, it looks at the child welfare system, it looks at even just our educational institutions, and it really looks at the way that these systems and institutions have held up very colonial and very racialized, policies within. It's at this point now where we're looking at this notion of how do we deconstruct, how do we break down some of these old systems that have perpetuated this hateful violence towards people of color, towards Indigenous peoples, towards people with disabilities, towards the LGBTQ2 plus community. And I think that when it came into this spotlight, it made, well, for one, businesses and corporations and academic institutions and nonprofit organizations, and you name it, and even just communities in general, it made them uh, almost feel obligated to respond. And it's interesting because in the world of inclusion or equity and diversity work, you know, there's always been activists who've been trying to push this work inside of these systems. And oftentimes they get met with a lot of resistance. But in this time, even though there's a lot of challenges and barriers, there's an opportunity here for a different kind of dialogue. And so, in the work that I'm doing, for example, with the Canadian Race Relations Foundation, people were donating money to the foundation in order to solicit a response and also to gather money so that we could put out concrete actions like education kits, which is what we're doing at the current moment. And then there's also with the Canadian Center for Diversity and Inclusion, there's this massive interest by organization and agencies to start having conversations around unconscious bias, around diversity and inclusion fundamentals, around what respect in the workplace looks like, or managing bias in hiring. To a higher level, there's a lot of authenticity here. As well, though, there's also a lot of work, and my I guess my fear is that it could still be utilized as empty symbolism, as a checkbox, as okay, we've done this, now let's move on. And my hope and my optimism is that most of these corporations and most of these agencies and most of these people that are getting this training, this anti-racism training, the knowledge that is being shared and given by individuals or agencies, my hope is that they're really taking that knowledge seriously and that they're really looking internally to make the changes that are going to make their agencies and corporations better equipped to handle issues or instances of diversity and inclusion within their workplace, or to even understand the innovation that agencies and businesses can gather from having a diverse and equitable workplace. One that isn't having those barriers, or one that isn't based on culture fit, where you got to fit the culture of the agency, or there's a quick out for you, or the ones of the unwritten rules, where you walk into a corporation and there's the unwritten code that you must abide by. These are the type of systems, whether informal or formal, that we have to start to address and tear down. And even now, when I see the TikTok videos and I hear the information about the Micmac fishermen out in the Maritimes at the East Coast, and the discrimination and direct overt racism that they're facing from non-Indigenous fisheries, the lack of response from the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, and even the government's inaction to want to intervene in defending treaty rights to that area, treaties that were signed in this country. So, at that level, this whole COVID-19 pandemic has rocked the way in which we do things, the way we interact with each other, the way that we communicate. It's changed the way we do things, but it's highlighted a lot of barriers, gaps, and inequities in our community, especially when you look at anti-Asian racism that stemmed out of COVID-19, when you look at anti-Black racism and you look at the tragic death of George Floyd. And then even there was that the name's eluding me, but that young runner who was just taking a run and got shot while he was running. These things have been highlighted continuously, perpetuated by how the media kind of puts it out there and how that and their own bias and stereotypes in reporting. But it also showed the inequities of Indigenous communities in Canada, their access to healthcare, their inadequate housing. This pandemic has brought up so many of those issues I think Canadians need to be concerned and alarmed about. And this is where education becomes a valuable and vital piece of how we do this, because we have what I like to refer to as historical amnesia. We sit here in our country and we don't remember all the things of the past. We don't know what an Indian Act is. We don't understand that there was moments in Canada where people were fighting for their rights. We don't understand that there was head tax back in the day, or selective immigration based on pseudoscientific racial theories. We have to remember and realize that this was very real part of our country's existence. And so until we can accept the truth of colonialism in Canada, we'll never truly be post-colonial, because it's still going to be embedded in the systems that are prevalent and apparent today. And so I think, one thing that this has done is it the opportunistic point of view is it's created an opportunity for dialogue, and meaningful and engaged and important dialogue. And that's my optimistic side of things. And I hope that we do see some concrete and sincere changes. For a number of years, we've been at the stage of talking. And we've talked for a while, and we've talked about instances, we've had inspiring presentations, and it's always amazing when we get together and have these conversations. I've been now doing this work for over 10 years, directly involved in this work. And I never thought to myself that I would ever look back and say, wow, it's been over 10 years of educating, of pushing policy change, of confronting myths and stereotypes and prejudice, and confronting bias and learning about bias and educating about bias. There's a lot to do, and it can seem very overwhelming to people that are just coming into this space. Where I want to give kind of a micro level action is and it's something that my grandma once told me. It's some of the best advice that I'd ever received as a young person. And when I was going into university, I read my mom's journal about all the treatment that she's faced, and what she's encountered in her life. And it made me very angry. And I remember talking to my grandma, and my grandma always told me that, sometimes in life when we go into spaces or we're around new people, it's important that we listen to them, that we observe and listen to their experiences before we come in and speak, because our words are important, they're impactful. And what our knowledge and our wisdom is so valuable to any situation, that you want to make sure that when you speak, you don't want to speak for just hearing your own voice or the sake of hearing sound. You want to speak because your words have meaning. You've thought about them, they're impactful, and they're going to contribute to the conversation or the situation. My grandma always said the best thing you could do is listen. Listen, 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 and practice patience. And the more you listen, the more you observe, the more you will learn from people. You will learn from their lived experiences. You will learn about who they are, how they observe the world, and you'll learn different things about the world that you never thought you could learn by just practicing active listening. So growing up, I use that in my education. I use that in my business meetings. I've used that in anything that I've done since. Is if I go into a new room, I really listen to people. I want to listen. I want to hear their stories. And I want to understand their experiences. The problem in our country is we haven't done a good job at listening, and we haven't done a good job at really actively listening, where we take that moment to sit back, listen, observe, understand, and collect, and really build that trust and relationship around our lived experiences in this country. And that's such a valuable piece to it. So I really credit my grandma with teaching me that at a very young age, because it's done well for me. It's made me observe and think, and critically examine things and situations that I'm in. So as an action and recommendation that I tell a lot of people, it's time to listen. It's time to hear the stories of Indigenous people when we talk about truth and reconciliation. It's time to hear the stories of racialized individuals in Canada, or immigrant populations that have come here that are telling their stories, or refugees that have come to resettle in Canada who are telling their stories. It's our time to listen. And it's so important that we understand that our systems are not perfect, that even though we come from a multicultural, pluralistic society that is viewed as a human rights nation, that internally here we have issues of racism, we have issues of oppression, we have issues of systems that are still very colonized systems, and we have to recognize that. One of the other actions that I always tell everybody is you got to start reading or watching documentaries of things that you're not used to. And you have to diversify your in group. If you're going to the same four people with all the same problems and the same information, you're going to get the four same perspectives coming back at you. This is where it's important to go and expand your circle, expand your in group, and have different perspectives that you can talk to about these situations, so that you're having conversations at your community level, and you're understanding some of the conversations that are going on. But we live in the time of tech, so everybody has access to Google, so you can Google it. You know, I guess the biggest verb now is I've Googled it, or I've Googled. You know, you can go on there, you can find anything you want on the internet today, and you can learn about anything that you want to learn about. It's always inspiring to hear from speakers, and it's always inspiring to get different, unique perspectives on things. But if you're not reading literature that's differing than how your bias functions or the way that you see your worldview, then you're never going to expand or change your perspective on life. And I think that that's where this change is going to come, because it's an uncomfortable space for us to have conversation. You know, we know that talking about race and talking about inclusion, discrimination, all those things can be challenging. A lot of people are scared that they're going to make mistakes with language, or they're going to be called out on certain things. But I think that this is a moment where we have an opportunity now to read amazing literature coming out from indigenous peoples, coming out from black writers, you know, coming out from you know, people of color. Like, there's large contributions in literature now, even more so than when I was studying 20 years ago, where we have a real opportunity to engage with unique literature, watch amazing documentaries that are coming on live streaming things like Netflix and Amazon Prime. We're exposed to the change. But when we watch a documentary, we can't just cry because of the ending. We have to analyze and ask ourselves, why did that happen? What in the system allowed that to happen? And what can we do to educate about changing these systems so that it doesn't happen again? And I'll leave with one example. I was sitting in a pub here in Lethbridge a couple of years ago, and I was sitting there listening in. And it was in northern Saskatchewan, and it was the Colton Boushie trial. And I remember sitting there alone, and I was reading online. I was watching my phone, and the verdict came out that he was not guilty of murder of Colton Boushie. And I remember the sinking feeling in my chest and my gut at that time. And I was a professor of Aboriginal law. I was teaching a class that semester, and so I knew. And I was also director of Indigenous Student Affairs at the university at that time, and so I knew full well that I was going to have to engage in these conversations on campus. That I was going to have to provide a safe space for students on campus who weren't going to feel welcomed walking into their classrooms. And I just had this sinking feeling that I could not believe at this time, when you look back at the Neil Stonechild cases, or all the cases that we have here in Canada, that I was studying in my undergraduate degree. I could not believe that that had happened, and that was heartbreaking. And it just it just almost brought up this feeling that Indigenous lives don't matter. And that's the area from which my mom is from, up in northern Saskatchewan. So we had to support our students and we had to have these conversations. But it always takes an incident like this for us to have difficult conversations when we should really start making those changes. So I always ask people, you know, it's about reading, understanding, learning, and just trying to be a really good and supportive ally along the way, or a co-conspirator. And hopefully through some of those easier, lower micro level actions, you know, we can start to see some important changes in our society and in our community. And those are my optimistic hopes, in order to get to this notion of concrete change.